The murder of Ashling Murphy is one of those stories, or I suppose one of those crimes that is always, it's just been one of the things that have stuck in people's minds just because of the sheer savagery of it, I suppose, and the fact that a school teacher, an ordinary young woman, was killed so brutally. But now, a couple of years on, we have kind of the last final outworkings of the case where Jozef Puska's his brothers and his wife and his sisters-in-law have all been convicted of withholding information, basically.
Yeah, so I suppose a lot of people will know that Ashling Murphy, she was 23 at the time. She was out walking on the canal bank in Tullamore in Offaly on 12th of January 2022, and she was murdered by Jozef Puska. He stabbed her 11 times in the neck, as you said. He's found guilty of that and he's serving a life sentence. But this week, his brothers, so they are Marek Puska and Lubomir Jr., they were convicted of withholding information, basically that they were aware that Jozef had killed somebody on the night and didn't disclose it to Gardaí. And then their two wives, Josephina Grunzova, she's a 32-year-old, and Viera Gaziova, they were also convicted of basically burning Jozef Puska's clothes and then obviously impeding the Gardaí in that way. So the four had pleaded not guilty and the trial started in May.
Yeah, so it was a very long-running trial. There was a lot of legal argument. There was a lot of pre-trial hearings, obviously given the nature of the fact that the crime was so notorious. That would have all been a feature. Now, just as we came up to the trial, Jozef Puska's wife pled guilty, though we only heard that in the aftermath of the jury reaching a verdict. Yeah. What was the charge she pled guilty to? So,
Lucia had also been charged with withholding information from Gardaí, basically that she was aware that Jozef had come home with injuries to his body, that he told her he'd killed a girl, and also that the bike found near Ashling Murphy's body was Jozef's, that she withheld this information from Gardaí. So she had indicated also that she was going to plead not guilty, but when there was a lot of legal argument basically that took place, which is in the absence of the jury before the judge, before this trial got underway, I think it was 12 days of legal argument. And as part of this, Lucia, Jozef Puska's wife, tried to get statements that she'd given to the Gardaí thrown out, as did one of the brothers' wives. So when the judge ruled that these statements were going to be allowed before the jury, this was then that Lucia pleaded guilty. So it was literally the week that the others were to go on trial. So in order to not prejudice the jury, the judge put a reporting restriction on revealing that his wife had pleaded guilty to these offences, and then that obviously was lifted this week then.
So that was only heard as the verdict came in. Now, if we go back to the actual crime itself, it was a motiveless crime, I suppose. Jozef Puska, when he came to court, put forward this kind of ridiculous defence that he'd come across her having suffered injuries and basically tried to help her. And absolutely, an argument without credibility. Yeah. Put that family through a long trial and no doubt very traumatic trial as well, to hear of all that evidence. Yeah. And also, obviously, he gave evidence himself, and, all of that denial just stuck with it the whole way through. But I suppose in the course of this trial, we hear that he was, at the very least, telling his own family a different story at times in the aftermath of it. Yeah. And also that even though these people knew that he had been, well, I mean, they certainly would have had to suspect at the very least that he'd seriously injured or possibly killed a woman. They still conspired basically to keep him away from the Gardaí and away from telling the truth, and that is why they've come before the court. So obviously in the aftermath there was he returned to the home where this whole family were living in the one house. Yeah,
so Jozef Puska, his wife, the two couples, so his two brothers and their two wives, so 6 adults and 14 children, were all living in a 4-bedroom house in Muckla, County Offaly at the time of the murder. And what basically happened was, bear with us because basically these people changed their statements. The brothers changed their statements a few times, but essentially, as we know, Ashling Murphy was killed in the afternoon time, and then very quickly emergency services came on the scene but couldn't find her, couldn't save her, and then there was a manhunt for the person person that had been seen on the bike. There was other women that he had approached that day. So Gardaí were obviously investigating this murder. And then at the same time, what the brother Marek, one of Joseph's brother,
after she's killed, Ashling Murphy, Jozef Puska's, there's actually another man is initially a suspect, but Jozef Puska, I think it's a few hours after he killed her, he lands back in the house, basically.
Yeah, but but what what was told to Gardaí was, so 2 days after Ashling Murphy was murdered, Marek Puska gave a statement to Gardaí. At this time, he was being questioned. At this time, Jozef Puska was in hospital in Dublin for his injuries. And Marek Puska told Gardaí that he'd woken up on the day of the murder, he'd woken up around 12:30 p.m. And Joseph's wife told him that Jozef had left the house about 30 minutes previous. He wanted to spend time with Jozef, he said, so he went looking for him. Then they got concerned, and later on in the evening, Lubomir Jr., the other brother, also started looking for him. And that evening they went to report.
Why did they come concerned? Did they?
It didn't go into details, but I think, that's what they said. That's the way they put it to Gardaí. And so then later on that evening, they actually went to the Garda station to report him missing. But obviously the Garda's focus at the time.
Then he wasn't missing at that point.
Well, yes, but this was the whole case. This is the way it was presented, that they gave these statements saying that they'd reported him missing, and at this time, obviously, the Gardaí were focusing on the murder of Ashling Murphy, which was obviously massive headlines at the time. And so this is what they said. They said they hadn't seen him after early in the morning that day. And then a couple of days later, then Marek, the brother, went and said that he did return home, and that he told Gardaí that he told the brothers that he was trying to take his own life, and that a woman came up and tried to stop him from doing this. And then he kind of said things like, I might have hurt her, I'm not sure if she's dead or alive. And then Marek admitted that he might have said to his wife that he thinks Jozef killed a girl, but he said he was never told this, he only inferred this. So then when he was arrested then days later, I think it was 8 days later, for impeding the prosecution into Jozef's alleged crime at the time, then he told Gardaí, he went into more detail, but he claimed that Jozef told him this story, that he was trying to harm himself and this woman had come along to help him. So the state's case was that this was all lies, that from 9:30 p.m. that night, that the brothers were aware of Jozef, that he'd come home with injuries, that he'd told them that he killed a girl, and that the only reason that they acted was in order to stop Jozef from being apprehended for this crime, and they were ultimately found guilty of this. And then I suppose in the case of the wives, it was that they were told to burn the clothes. So they put forward various different defences. One of the wives said that she was Vieira, that she was basically told by one of the men that Jozef had killed a girl, but she didn't believe it. She didn't believe that Jozef was capable of this. She thought that it was just rantings. And the other wife had said that basically she didn't know the gravity of Jozef's crimes, that she was just asked, I think it was over Facebook, they were called and asked to burn the clothes, that they did so. So I suppose the jury came back with a majority verdict on the two wives, and there was a unanimous verdict in relation to the two brothers, that basically that they were aware that from 9:30 p.m. that evening, that they were aware that Jozef had killed a girl, and that the only actions that they took were in order to stop him from being prosecuted for this offence. Which
is clearly what happened, because if you remember, there was great confusion at the time Ashling Murphy had been injured. There had been, obviously there'd been people had come across Jozef Puska, so they had a description of it. Another man had been wrongly identified as being a suspect. There was confusion, obviously. It was a very, there was extremely high profile case, obviously. And Jozef Puska, in the aftermath of killing Ashling Murphy, he'd eventually fled up to Dublin and had eventually landed up in James's hospital.
Yes, because eventually, so this is how it was confusing, because these statements were sort of drift fed, and this was actually said by the state in their case, that the brothers constantly changed their statements. And in one of the statements, Lubomir Jr., one of Joseph's brothers, he had originally said he hadn't seen Joseph that day, and then he admitted that he had, and he said that he basically, the last he'd seen of him was when he went to his parents came and took Joseph to hospital. We obviously know that Joseph ended up in hospital, and that the gardai, the two and two was put together, and the gardai were called up to Dublin, and they noted the injuries then. So that was what they tried to say. They tried to say that they hadn't seen him, but obviously it was, nobody believes that, and it was clear that they had seen him, and they were all aware from that evening of what had happened
with Jozef Puska. He landed up in hospital in Dublin.
Yeah.
He had wounds to his abdomen, and he had claimed he had been stabbed in Blanchardstown, and there was some sort of report of some sort of incident in Blanchardstown anyway.
Yeah.
He'd had 3 stab wounds, and he ended up in James's hospital. So all of this was, I suppose, there was great confusion at the time, because the guards were obviously looking to solve this case.
Yeah.
I mean, a really, really brutal murder. And what all of these 5 people who've ultimately ended up in court, they managed to cloud the water for a period of time.
Yeah.
Now, when you hear some of the excuses given, one of his brothers, I think it's Lubomir, he kind of says that he didn't know exactly what had happened, and that he admits not disclosing stuff, but all of this managed to, there was huge fear and huge public reaction.
Yeah,
and this all managed to cloud the water at the time. Yeah,
and his defence team in the closing speech, their argument that they tried to claim was that the reason that, he didn't believe that his brother had done this, and that in fact there was actually somebody being questioned at the time, which was the wrong person, as we know now. So, there was a cloud of confusion at the time, and this all fed into those stories, I suppose. And another case that one of the brothers tried to put forward as well was that so he had inferred that Joseph had killed somebody, but he was basically worried that he was going to be prosecuted for this offence. And there is some kind of, obviously, it was referenced in court how since the Eimear bombing, there was obviously legislation changes made where, it is a crime if you are aware of information relating to a serious crime and you don't disclose that. But there is also human rights where, you can use the defensive, or you can basically keep silent if you think that it's going to wrongly implicate yourself. So this was all tried to bring in. They tried to bring all this stuff into it as well, that basically he was really worried that he was going to be wrongly implicated in this. He wasn't fully aware of events as he claimed at the time, which we obviously know was wrong. And then also one of the wives had tried to say that she was worried that she was going to be kicked out on the street with her children. She was going to be left homeless. So these were all, obviously ultimately rejected by the jury. But
yeah, I mean, there's a difference, like, on everybody who's a suspect in a crime or being arrested can remain silent. I mean, that is your fundamental right.
Yeah.
But of course, they didn't do that. Like, they went along another route and gave false information. And that's like, they could have been brought in, just say it might be, sort of understandable that they don't want to get involved or whatever. They can just stay silent. But what they did actually was impede the investigation and put it in a whole other way.
And they drift-fed information, I think, because they went in like on different occasions and said certain things and then said other things and then admitted that they were aware that Joseph had come home with injuries to his abdomen.
Yeah.
And then they tried to make up this mental story that he was trying to self-harm and Ashling Murphy tried to help him and all these kind of things.
I mean, and there was also a bizarre defence of somebody saying one of the women saying, I think, that he admitted being involved in something, but she didn't believe it because, I mean, that's simply not credible. I mean, also underlying all this is, obviously this case was highly public at this stage. I mean, they're sort of, almost in their statements, it's like they don't know that this is a huge national story almost, and they couldn't connect the events, the Ashling Murphy events, with what Jozef Puska is telling them.
Well, they tried to use the air of confusion, I suppose, around all that. And, and then they tried to point to the fact, because I suppose was it 2 days before Gardaí were aware of Jozef Puska in the hospital and that, his links to the case. So that was, I suppose, originally the statements. The statements were originally, I suppose,
without him being identified by guards.
Exactly. Yeah.
However, obviously the story was absolutely massive, and even if you're, if English isn't your first language, you're living in a small town. I mean, they must have been, it sort of relies on them giving statements, but not being able to connect with the death of a woman. Of
course,
publicly.
and like these crimes are as horrific as it was, for a woman to be killed while she's exercised and completely randomly attacked. They are thankfully very rare in Ireland. So as you said, it was everywhere. And if somebody comes home with injuries to their abdomen, mentioning a girl, mentioning a knife, and you hear that a woman has been killed, and then, you're asked to burn clothes. Like, surely, fair enough, they had nothing to do with his actual crime, but surely, if you put these things together and you make up your minds that there has to be something going on here. Yeah. And that was the whole state's case, which was ultimately ratified by the jury, that despite what all these people were saying, the only possible inferring from their actions was that they were aware of what he did and they were trying to cover it up. And the same with burning the clothes.
Exactly. I mean, you don't burn clothes because, there's only one reason to set fire to a group of clothes. I mean, in her closing speech, Anne-Marie Lawler, who the prosecutor, said that they knew what Jozef had done shortly after 9:30 p.m. on the night of the murder. She said Jozef told Ludimir Jr. and Marek, who then related to the others in the house, and the only reason for withholding of information or the burning of clothes was the defendants didn't want them to be apprehended or prosecuted for the murder. Yeah. Now, they obviously, they've been in and out of court every day. They've been on bail, as is standard practice. When do we hear a sentence, or was there a date given?
So it was put back to July 7th, but from what I could see, it's just going to be for reports that day. It's going to be a mention, basically, because there's obviously various different reports that will be ordered by the judge that will be assessed before sentences is handed down. And I assume there'll be opportunity for Ashling Murphy's family to give a victim impact statement if they want as well. So I don't think we're actually going to get a sentence on July 7th. But, it will be back then.
And they were there, weren't they? For not every day, I think, but quite regularly there.
As far as I'm aware, they were there for at least some of it, the family. So, and I suppose for them, the trial was very high profile. It went on for so long. And I suppose it has to be said as well that, as much as the family members tried to claim confusion and that, they didn't take part in a horrific crime, but at the same time, they burnt evidence. So the fact that we all listened to the crazy stuff that Jozef Puska tried to put forward in his offence, the family had to sit through that trial for months. And I guess if the Gardaí had the clothes, the evidence there would have been overwhelming. She even told, it was even told how the wife that burned the clothes said there was a lot of blood on the t-shirt and that they were stuck together. So if the Gardaí had that evidence, and also the knife was never found, and obviously that's crucial evidence. One of the brothers denied that he told someone to get rid of the knife as well. That was heard in the trial. So all that crucial evidence wasn't there, which obviously, ultimately Jozef Puska was found guilty of murder, but that would have surely helped the prosecution's case, and maybe the family wouldn't have had to sit through such an ordeal if they had that stuff available to them. But obviously, because of the actions of those family members, that wasn't possible. So, but that has to be remembered as well, because ultimately it's Ashling's family who, again, have had to relive the horrific details of her
100%. And I mean, of course, you can always stay silent, but to get involved there and try and pour, to confuse the matter is what they've really been convicted of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll come back to it again when we get to sentencing, or even the sentencing hearing.
Yeah, thanks, Niall.
Thanks, Eimear.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.